As I mentioned, there's three groups of individuals that we're particularly interested in when we think about cybersecurity businesses in the workplace. Those three groups are our customers, our workers, and our leaders. In this mini module, I'm going to begin to talk to you about our interest in leaders in cybersecurity, business leaders, organizational leaders, leaders in the workplace. And we certainly know that the security of an organization can be traced to the top of an organization. And as we think about the security of the organization and make this very simple point that it starts at the top, you hear about this with many different types of concepts, that organizational culture, values. All of those sorts of things can be traced to the top of an organization and point to the leadership of an organization. With this, I can point out that there are several cybersecurity leadership principles that are relevant. And we're going to talk about those cybersecurity leadership principles just as way of an introduction to how leaders function in the workplace in regards to cybersecurity. First principle is that communication is vital to effective cybersecurity. Now let's point out, it's not the technology here. It's not the technology that's important in terms of cybersecurity. It is the human element in this principle that is important. And in particular, leaders need to focus on a couple of different areas in their communication efforts. They must communicate policies. What are those cybersecurity policies? Now, certainly the leader in this case wouldn't necessarily be the CEO doing it, but someone, the CEO must ensure that one of the business leaders, or whether it's a small or larger business, it would depend on who's doing that communication, is telling everyone about the cybersecurity policies that are in place in the organization. And those policies obviously would be written, would be responsive, would be measurable, and would be actionable. And in pointing this out, the policies will often also stipulate what happens when policies aren't followed. In other words, leaders need to communicate the penalties for ineffective cybersecurity, or human error, insider error, errors or mistakes, and how are we going to respond, and what will the consequences be if individuals do violate cybersecurity protocol. We need to make sure that workers are aware of those, and it's the leaders in an organization that have to communicate those penalties. They also should communicate the enforcements of when changes have been made because of cybersecurity violations. This relates to this notion of deterrence that we will bring up time and again in this course. And the idea is if people know that others have been penalized or sanctioned for violating cybersecurity rules, then we'd be less likely to do it ourselves. Now, in this context, when we're talking about workplace behavior, we're not talking about violating personnel information and talking about what was done with a worker or a specific case, but we are talking about sharing information to show that policies are being followed, that penalties are being applied, and that there are enforcements when people violate cybersecurity protocol. Now, leaders would also communicate the connections between business and cybersecurity. In the business module that follows this group of mini modules, you'll learn about many of those connections between business and cybersecurity. The connections stem from ideas about cybersecurity promotes good business, cybersecurity could be a business itself, cybersecurity is based upon the whole notion of security And secure organizations are going to be organizations where employees can develop and feel like they're a part of an organization. Business leaders will be communicating those sorts of principles or ideas to their workers. Leaders also need to communicate the need for incident-based response planning. Here again, it may not be the CEO that's doing this. It may be someone else in the organization who is leading up, is what we're talking about, and leading down. Your chief information officer, for example, or someone in security is going to hopefully tell the CEO and the other members of the leadership team that there needs to be incident-based response planning. They need to be ready for that situation where a cybersecurity event occurs. If they're not ready for that event, then when it occurs, it's that much harder. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean by incident-based response planning. There's several stages that Chris Moscovitas talked about, and he wrote a book just recently called Cybersecurity Program Development for Business. And the stages of incident-based response planning that Moscovita talks about include stages that would actually occur if an incident occurs. And that first incident would be identifying the incident. At some point after an incident occurs, someone in the organization identifies the incident. They identify the incident, and that incident, it may be soon after the incident actually occurred, it may be days after, it may be months after, whatever. Someone needs to identify that incident, and it could be a part of someone just accidentally finding it out, or it could be that someone actually was doing an audit and noticed the incident. The next immediate stage is to contain the incident. Now, containing the incident would be to simply stop it from spreading, so that that incident isn't ongoing. The next stage that Moscovita talks about is treating the incident, where mechanisms are placed in there to begin to address whatever happened and why it happened. The next stage is incident recovery, where the leaders would then spend some time trying to recover whatever they lost, to figure out what was lost, to figure out what information was out there, and to see what can be recovered, to see what the losses were, and to see how to go about putting the pieces back together, essentially. And the next stage is post-incident review, where at some point the team gets together and reviews what happened. Why did it happen? Who did it? How did they do it? How are we going to stop this from happening again? How are we going to respond to this better in the future? In this post-incident review, those sorts of questions are asked so that we can be as prepared as possible when cybersecurity incidents occur in our organization. And then Moscovita says you got to repeat it as needed. We don't just plan once. We don't just do one if we're doing a training to plan. We don't just do it once. Many organizations will do these things annually so that when it does happen, the organization is ready. Other authors have talked about, Wayne Lee and Keith Thwaite have talked about how poor cybersecurity planning, and they point to a few examples of organizations that weren't ready for an incident and they weren't prepared for an incident, and because they weren't prepared, the organizations then end up just having a poor response. And this poor response, again, can be traced to the leadership in the organization who was not prepared for something bad to happen. They say that poor cybersecurity planning leads to denial, where organizational leaders are going to then start trying to cover their tracks and say that whatever happened wasn't as bad as it seemed, and simply not owning the incident. And that is not just poor public relations. It can also create some potential legal issues for individuals, and the not being prepared. The organizational leaders, first thing they will do is to make excuses. There's also the problem of unstructured chain of command when there's not planning, according to Lee and Swait, that no one knows who's in charge, no one knows who's responding, no one knows who to seek out information from, or they seek it out from different people, and too many people may be in charge of responding to an incident, and those sorts of things can make it more difficult to respond to these cases. There's also a lack of foresight when organizations haven't developed their planning appropriately. Now, Lee and Swait suggest that there are ways that leaders can strengthen their incident-based response planning in cybersecurity incidents. I would suggest if you look at each of these, the word communicate comes through all of them. It's specifically stated in the fourth point, but securing participation from key stakeholders, that certainly begins with participating in communication and talking and getting to know those stakeholders. You can't secure participation from them without communicating with them. Also delineating their roles and identifying who does what. This group is responsible for containing, this group is responsible for public relations, this group is responsible for working with customers, this group is responsible for working with people in the organization, and so on. Lee and Swait also suggest tabletops. Tabletops are simply practice exercises where they actually go through an incident, spend a better part of a day, get in a room with all the key individuals that would be involved in responding, and pretend that an incident occurred, and then go through it and figure out how they would respond. And as I mentioned, communication, Lee and Swait said, is key in planning strength and having strong incident-based response planning for cybersecurity. There's a story you may have heard that I heard a while ago about a new admiral that was on a ship for the very first time. This admiral got on the ship and was cruising along on the ship, and they in the distance saw another ship. Well, the admiral, because he was on a new ship, figured that he had the right of way. So he got one of his sailors, and he said to the sailor, use the lights and flash a message to that other ship that they need to change their path 20 degrees. So he flashed the lights, said, change your path 20 degrees. They waited a minute, and the lights flashed back from the other vessel, and the lights flashed, change your path 20 degrees. Well, the admiral was not happy with that. The admiral said, tell them that I am a new admiral, one of the highest ranking people in the Navy. They need to change their path 20 degrees. The message came back, said, I'm just a sailor. I'm probably the lowest ranking person in the Navy. Change your path 20 degrees. So the admiral's a little frustrated and says, tell them this is the brand new ship, the newest ship in the fleet. They need to change their path 20 degrees. So they flashed the lights and said that message, and the lights flashed back. And the message was, this is a lighthouse. Change your path 20 degrees. Now, what's that story about? It's about communication. It doesn't really seem like it has anything to do with cybersecurity, but it does have to do with cybersecurity leadership. And cybersecurity leaders need to communicate well in a business. All leaders in a business need to communicate well about cybersecurity, about what the strategies are, about what the policies are, about what the penalties are for not following policy, what happens, what has happened when people violated the policy, and why we have to have these policies and the need for a secure organization, a secure cyber environment.